you have Dr. Ramakrishnan who would talk about the Kerala situation in detail, but I just refer to certain problems that perhaps all of us can look at when we discuss the question of modernity. Some of the contradictions that we have in modernity. Uh, One problem I would say is the contradiction between uh, between the physical architecture and the mental architecture. Now that pertains not to Kerala alone. That pertains to the entire country. We see that you have developed highways. You have very highly advanced kind of technology in place. But nevertheless, your mind has become very narrow. This certainly is a contradiction. Why this narrow-mindedness? When you see that the world has become so broad and wide, that is one contradiction. Within a second contradiction, I would say, is that within the uh, mental architecture, you see a number of exclusions. You see a number of rejections. This is the problem that several scholars today raise in relation to the mental architecture. When you talk about a specific culture, when you talk about Indian culture, when you talk about Bengali culture, when you talk about Kannada culture, you have a certain stereotyped notion of culture, and you select certain icons to represent these particular cultures. So that is, that creates another problem. That creates another contradiction. So it is the presence of such contradictions that perhaps prompt us to talking merely about a particular language. You don't say that Hindi is the national language. You, uh, a particular area is the icon of India, or a particular cultural manifestation is that represents India or Indian culture. The question of Bhasha nationalism, for example, which has come to the fore in recent days because of discussions raised by even people in power, that would prompt us to talk about the polyphonous nature of Indian culture and the multiple languages, multiple cultures that we have in India today, that we have in several other parts of the world, not just in India. So that is what prompts us to talk about multiple modernities, uh, many modernities. So some of these questions will certainly be raised in the discussion today in relation to some of the languages and cultures that are represented by this panel. I would request Hemant Desai to participate and make his intervention.
Hello. Thank you, sir. At the outset, let me thank the organizers for having me here and organizing this wonderful session on Indian modernities. I would like to begin by making a differentiation between three terms which are generally conflated and confused in academia and outside academia, which are modernism, modernization, and modernity. These are three different terms which have got three different kinds of meanings. But to sum it up very loosely, modernization refers to technological advancement. Like in the university, we install computer laboratory, digitize infrastructure, etc. That refers to modernization, right? Modernism, on the other hand, was a movement in arts and literature, which arose in different languages in India around 1950s onwards, right? And modernity, to my mind, and as some of the philosophers, some of the scholars in sociological sciences and history have pointed out, it's a it was an intellectual project. It was a civilizational project which contributed to the evolution of certain social forms in maybe mid 17th century in Europe, okay? And Professor Anthony Giddens would tell us that then onwards, those social forms, spread out and went to the different parts of the globe, right? So I would like to underline this fact that modernity as a civilizational project has to undergird the other two concepts that I just mentioned, modernism and modernization. But what we see increasingly happening across the globe is that modernity has failed to bind together these two other processes, one in literary arts, in culture, and other in the field of um, governance, modernization, improvement of infrastructure, etc., etc. The second thing that we have to be clear about is the fact that modernity is not a spatio-temporal concept. We cannot talk about modernity in terms of space and time. That means, as Anthony Giddens said, modernity arose in Europe and then went to other parts of the world. No, as Professor Ravindran just rightly pointed out, modernity arose in different historical times in different parts of the globe simultaneously. And those were the different varieties of modernities that the Eurocentric discourse of modernity has not taken into account so far. So today I would like to talk about those other modernities which have been described by the use of multiple designations like uh, multiple modernities, alternative modernities, polyphonic modernities, etc., etc. The second point that I wanted to underscore was that modernity is also not a temporal concept. We cannot talk about modernity in terms of time, that once upon a time, maybe in 15th century, in the medieval era, we were very conservative, we were unmodern, so to say, and by the dawn of 20th century, we became modern. No, that would be a very fallacious way of looking at modernity. For example, modernity as a movement, as evolution of different social forms, emerged in India maybe in medieval era with the Bhakti movement, right? When the saint poets started talking about casteless society, they started talking about gender equality. They started talking about recognizing the humanity of every individual, right? They started talking about equality, freedom of expression, uh, right? So, and I would not say that the beginning of the modernity would stop there. We can still go further in past and say that the Harappan civilization was the epitome of modernity that the world has ever seen in its evolutionary history. Like we go to the Bronze Age, and there were three major civilizations: Harappan civilization, Mesopotamian civilization, and Egyptian civilization, right? Out of the three, the Harappans were the most modern to my mind. Why? Because it was it was a completely casteless society. No doubt there were hierarchies on different lines. Maybe it was a class-based society, but those hierarchies were also comparatively flattened, so flattened that they didn't interfere into the daily life of the individuals. Recent studies have come out about the cartography of Harappan civilization. And one of the fascinating things about the civilization is that they didn't believe in erecting huge statues. They didn't believe in erecting large palaces, right? They believed in erecting huge reservoir for water conservation. So if you see the map of the city, that is the artistic map created imaginatively by artists, the city was surrounded by a series of huge reservoirs because one of the cities of the Harappan civilization I'm talking about is Dholavira. Since I am from Gujarat, and Dholavira is based in Gujarat, so if you the excavation site of Dholavira will point out that the city was in the midst of huge reservoirs. So they had that ecological consciousness. The bone structure of the skeletons that have been excavated has revealed that uh, almost all people of the city of Dalavira were having nutrition-rich food. So their bones were developed. They were not facing the issue of hunger, right? And most importantly, there are no traces of any central or centralizing authority in Dholavira. So, to my mind, it was a stateless society. It was a society in which human beings had divided not the planet Earth in terms of national boundaries or regional boundaries. It was a society in which the people had divided human beings into clans and moieties, right? And I think I would like to link it up with, uh, with the discourse that had emerged in the latter half of the 20th century in Western philosophy, in the works of Deleuze and Guattari, who were talking about a new model of society. If you read his Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, which came out in maybe 1970, and the sequel to the book, The Thousand Plateau, which came 5 to 6 years later. In both the text, these writers are trying to look out for societies which are stateless. There is no centralizing authority. It is the people of the society which govern themselves. They take upon themselves to govern themselves without any centralizing authority. And probably Deleuze and Guattari's work also traces its lineage to the work that was being done in anthropology around the time. For example, the work of Pierre Clastre, whose book is Society Against State, where he talks about uh, different Native American societies or African segmentary societies, which have successfully lived without a state or a centralizing authority for thousands of years. And they've been able to conserve the land on which they have stayed. They've been able to conserve the nature from which they drew resources. And that is the kind of modernity that on the threshold of the 21st century we have to look up to. Because with the climate change and global warming at our doorstep, uh, if we don't imagine alternative ways of living, if we don't imagine different ways of being modern, and if we don't go back to our tradition of modernity, then probably uh, the life on the planet Earth, not only the human life but life in general, will have very less time to survive. Because this is the model of development or the model of modernization, we call Vikas, right? Is an unsustainable model. And people like Dipesh Chakravarti have been arguing consistently about the urgent need for the people to wake up to the call of the nature and, start living differently. You know, it's a vision of a decarbonized, unurban, non-technocratic society. So to my mind, it's high time that we also talk about this kind of modernity in this day and age. Yeah. Thank you.
Professor Manu Chakravarti.
Good morning, everybody. In fact, the title Indian Modernities, as Dr. Ravindran has pointed out, in fact, it's quite open, very sweeping, and also an ever evolving issue. It has multiple dimensions, and therefore, I think we must try to understand it through diverse perspectives and multiple trajectories. More importantly, I also believe that when we talk of these definitions, concepts, and when we try to conceptualize, we must openly admit that we run into several kinds of paradoxes, contradictions, and dualities. But what for me is very important is that the idea, the concept, uh, pushes us into very deep existential, experiential realities. So we cannot understand experiential, existential realities, human life, through categories, through definitions. Therefore, when we talk of modernities, I think we run into very difficult problems, and they cannot be addressed through mere ideational constructs or hypotheses. The first distinction that I would make, which I think is inevitable, is that when we deal with Indian modernities, whatever they mean, we must make this distinction that there is a fundamental difference between those modernities that came to us through westernization, Western modernity, through colonialism, and such forces. In fact, many things were engendered in our societies and cultures by those alien forces. So I think it's necessary to address this issue of pre-colonial modernities, not just see modernity through one lens. So it would be wrong to describe whatever is pre-colonial as pre-modern. It doesn't work that way. And therefore, modernity is not necessarily a product of westernization or colonization. So how do we turn to, I'll make a very brief attempt through several illustrations to draw your attention to some pre-modern elements. And of course, I try to draw from my Kannada culture. What are the problems when we try to struggle to identify Indian modernities and see them in juxtaposition with European Western traditions of modernity? This is a major thesis that has to be developed elsewhere, but I will only, as I mentioned a little earlier, try to illustrate it through some concrete examples from the Kannada tradition, which I'm sure is true of other cultural, linguistic, religious, philosophical traditions. In fact, I also believe that our attempts at decolonization, all the attempts that we have been making to decolonize, must go by alternative thought processes, images, metaphors, and epistemological traditions that are very different from what has been foisted on us by the colonial experience. So Eurocentrism has to be contested, but we have to contest it with categories, images, metaphors, not borrowed from those epistemological positions. We cannot fight the master using the master's language, master's idiom. I would also like to make it clear that my position is not a simplistic, sentimental nativism theory, but it demands a serious intellectual effort, especially during these times our times, when we are a witness to very beastly times, when crippling ideas of Indian past, that there was nothing that the Indian tradition did not have, and wild statements about ancient India, about Sanatana Dharma. So I think we run into difficult problems, very, very difficult problems when we turn to our own past. If there is the hegemony of the West, we also have a certain kind of hegemony in our so called native traditions. In fact, we are a witness to how we are being bullied into accepting a totalizing idea of Hindu Bharat, of Hinduism, Hindutva. But I think the struggle is to look for multiple alternatives. Multiple alternatives that give us multiple visions of what the Indian past could have been, not what it exactly was. Uh, in fact, in the Western tradition itself, questions were raised long ago. I mentioned just one or two. Raymond Williams, in his magnificent essay, he asked, when was modernism? Do you date it? Did it begin at all at a specific point of time in history? So, when was modernism? And if you turn to Habermas, he thinks of modernity as an unfinished project. Turn to Lyotard, the postmodern condition. For him, modernity represents advance, progress, but brutality, cruelty, oppression, and therefore to look for differences, multiplicities, pluralities. Uh, we can go on and on like this, but one important point for me is in the Kannada tradition, in whatever way we define modernity, modernity from the 10th century to the 21st century has never been seen as merely benevolent, progressive, and contributing to the advance of human civilization. Such a notion of modernity does not exist in the Kannada tradition. In fact, in the Kannada tradition, we operate with a very ambivalent position. Even when we turn to modern Kannada literature, in fact, we never even use the word modern, which of course has been translated while people refer to the Kannada tradition, but we use the word Navya, which meant new. But this Navya was in relation to Navodaya, Nava Udaya. And the term modern did not really figure in the minds because when our writers started writing, they were always aware of continuities, of borrowings. There may have been divergences, but nobody overlooked continuities. Nobody overlooked allegiance to the past, and there was that indebtedness. So there has been this tradition, and I do not clearly see any break, any definite break. So my whole point is that we cannot identify a starting point for modernity. And very serious critics, philosophers don't commit those mistakes. So where do I begin when I talk of how the Kannada cosmos opened up? I move from the 10th to the 16th centuries because that was a period when the Jaina tradition, when the Jaina cosmology flourished from Pampa, Ranna, down to Ratnakara Varne. All were against state power, state authority, violence, and the notion of a single truth. As the Jaina philosophical tradition upheld Anekantavada, the Anekanta, the Aneka, the multiple, the plural. So when you turn to the great masters, 10th to 16th century, not even the medieval period in the West, there was an openness, there was a certain kind of plurality of vision, which to this day continues, though much has been done to demolish this. And the other great influence was the influence of the Buddhist tradition, especially Nagarjuna, the Madhyamika school. So as we advance, as we progress, to use that word, there's always a turning back to the past, making impossible for anybody sensitive and serious to say, this is modern. When was not? this element of modernism built into the Kannada consciousness. I'm sorry, I'm saying Kannada because I want to be specific, because the others will open up their literary and cultural traditions. And more importantly, and this is very important for me because even very distinguished scholars can commit mistakes, very bad mistakes. In fact, when I turn to the 11th, 12th centuries, the Vachanakara movement, the Vachanas, now it was the great attempt to bring in the subaltern. We use the word subaltern, but they were the artisanal communities. In fact, the Devanga, the weavers, potters, cobblers, Basavana's ideal, not so much centered around caste. It was not a revolution about caste, but to make it a very inclusive culture and inclusive society. And therefore, the artisanal communities figured, and the resistance to state power, Bijjala, the king. You have hundreds of plays written on that, major plays, minor plays, all concentrating on what kind of a transformation. The word revolution is not used. In fact, it's a very exaggerated word. But the kind of transformation that would make society plural, that would make society inclusive. This is where a scholar like Ramanujan, in his translation and in his preface, speaking of Shiva, commits this mistake. If we are not aware, we commit those mistakes. He says that the Vachanakara movement, 12th century, was something like Puritanism, the puritanical work ethic. In fact, Tawney has that great thesis, Puritanism, religion and the rise of capitalism. Weber's thesis, Protestant work ethic, formation of capital. Ramanujan clearly says that our 12th century Vachanakara movement was something like the puritanical movement. Compares it with Puritanism, nothing could be farther from the truth than that. So the models have to come from within our indigenous traditions, from our indigenous native cultures. And I repeat again, this is not a very simplistic, sentimental understanding view of nativism, nativist theory. Now, it is this egalitarian consciousness, independent of any Western influence, that was the chief feature, the overriding feature of social transformation. Just 5 minutes, not more. I will stop here. I'll come. I'm sorry that he is not here, but he is in another session. H.S. Shiva Prakash captured it beautifully in the modern period. I jumped to the modern period. In his first collection of poems, Milarepa, from the Buddhist philosopher, 10th to 12th century, magnificent collection. When the Dalit and the Bandaya movements were going on, Shiva Prakash turned to the Buddhist tradition 10th to 12th century, Milarepa. And if Karnad, Lankesh and others concentrated on history going back to the Vachana tradition, in his magnificent plays, Mahachaitra is one play by Shiva Prakash and the other is Mante Swami Katha Prasanga. Shiva Prakash does not preoccupy himself with forces of history, of modern history, but turns to the artisanal communities, to Dalits, the life of the working class, and so creates another space, another understanding of what we would call modern, of what we call modernity, with no reference to modernism or modernization. In fact, if we turn to even the 20th century progressive movement, the Navodaya movement, the Nava badly translated as Renaissance, we should get back to a redefinition of categories, and to the Navya period, it's always a turning back to the past, which is not a mere sentimental return to the past, but to see what obligations we have, how we are obliged, what allegiances we have. And therefore, these are inheritances, these are traces. So, if we talk of Indian modernities, then we will have to talk of modernities without definitions, without crippling categories, but open up larger spaces of understanding, reflection, and turn to new modes of expression. I'll stop here. Thank you.
The discussions of both Dr. Hemant Desai and Professor Manu Chakravarti have left, led us to the understanding uh, that this is a complex concept that we are discussing here. Especially in the case of Dr. Manu Chakravarti, he referred to the complexity in the understanding of the word in relation to Kannada literature right from the 12th century, from the Vachana poets down to the present day. So I'm sure this is a situation that exists in other languages too, in other cultures too. Therefore, let us look at uh, some more of such complexities in relation to specific cultures. Uh, I would like Dr. E.V. Ramakrishnan to join the discussion.
Good morning, everyone. In fact, the context of the present discussion on Indian modernities, actually there are three important contexts. One, of course, is we now recognize that there is no monolithic, monumental European modernity which actually sets the agenda for all other nations, societies, cultures to follow. This has been the idea which actually which regulated the idea of modernity, that Europe in a way defined modernity once for all. In fact, Sanjay Subramaniam has a very interesting comment that modernity is not a virus which spreads from one society to the other, but it's something organic to each community, each society. It emerges from within the social, political, cultural matrix of each society. So, looked from such a perspective, we cannot but pluralize the idea of modernity. We need to actually see it in plural. Even Indian, there is no Indian modernity. We need to actually see it in terms of a plural kind of concept. And again, the question how to periodize, this was raised by all the three speakers early. We cannot actually again fix a date from where the modernity begins, and then so the question of periodizing modernity is a very contested kind of argument again. Let me actually come to the Kerala experience. Ravi, P.P. Ravindran has already mentioned this whole idea of Navothanam, Kerala Navothanam. If you look into this whole context of Navothanam, we need to actually see the role played by missionaries, if at all there is a point of origin of modernity in the context of Kerala. I would say the arrival of print. The arrival of print is a very important marker of modernity. We actually see, if you divide the long 19th century into two parts, the first half of 19th century in Malayalam is the time when printing presses are actually set up across Kerala. By the end of 19th century, there are about 50 printing presses all over Kerala. Then comes the dictionaries, Malayalam English dictionary, English Malayalam dictionary, Benjamin Bailey, and we have periodicals. We have Gundar, any number of the early arrival of periodicals, and subsequently the impact of print and printing presses, periodicals can be seen in the later part of the 19th century. That's where you have the arrival of Western forms of literature, particularly the novel. the novel marks the arrival of modernity in the domain of culture, in the domain of everyday society, everyday social life. And here again, translation actually is a very important. The first Malayalam novel, Ghadagavatham, The Slayer Slain, it actually is written in English, and uh, the wife of the missionary who wrote it, Mrs. Collins, her husband actually translates it into Malayalam. So Ghadagavatham, the missionary novel, also sets the tone for many such narratives further. And then we have the classic Indulekha and subsequently a number of imitations, etc. Again, two elements here. One is novel is possible in a society only when it achieves a certain level of mobility. Mobility defines modernity. That's why very often people say translation and travel are markers of modernity. We can actually see all these: translation, travel, mobility. But this was something which actually was available for the upper caste. The question of caste actually becomes central to our debate on modernity in the 19th century, mainly because Navothanam, or what we call Kerala Renaissance, was largely about the kind of radical shift in the attitude towards the lower caste and the lower caste attitude towards the rights and their basic human and other rights. If Indulekha came in the 1889, maybe a couple of years back, Narayana Guru, the towering figure who actually symbolizes Malayala, Kerala, Navothanam. So Narayana Guru consecrated in Arivipuram, a place called Arivipuram, a small village, a stone, and he called it Shiva. He said, I am consecrating Lord Shiva in this location. This was a revolutionary movement, beginning of revolutionary movement, because no Avarna, no lower caste person had ever exercised the right to consecrate a Hindu god. He was in a way breaching a certain kind of rule and a certain kind of line of control. And with that, perhaps Malayali imagination, I think there is a modern subjectivity. How is this modern subjectivity formed? The larger question is, in the context of modernities, is how is the modern subject formulated? It's not the same in the context of the upper caste and the lower caste. If you look at Saraswati Vijayam, a novel written in the same period as Indulekha, the question is not of really achieving success in the modern world. It's about basic human dignity. If you read Saraswati Vijayam, the novel is still a very powerful narrative about the kind of conditions which existed in Kerala. A lower caste young boy sings a song and is beaten by the servants of a Nambudiri, a Brahmin, and a series of events. But the question is, where would such a society where a young Avarna boy cannot even express his joy in song? You see, this is where Dilip Menon has actually argued that the lower caste actually entered modernity through its interface with Christianity. Conversion was a basic mode of achieving mobility. Within Hinduism, within Hindu religion, there was no way of becoming equal to a Brahmin. You are born a Brahmin, you can never achieve Brahminhood. You may be a great scholar, but you are never a Brahmin. So the question of achieving mobility meant leaving behind Hinduism. And that's where I do feel missionaries have contributed greatly towards the idea of modernity in Kerala. This is true of many other. I have understood this from my understanding of other languages, from Assamese to Odia to almost all Indian languages. You see, missionary modernity, colonial modernity had elements which are liberating and which greatly contributed towards an idea of a egalitarian society, egalitarianism, cosmopolitanism. Some of these values were very strongly entrenched in the narrative of modernity in Kerala, largely in the 19th century. And we also need to actually, Manu Chakrabarti did mention, see, these are ideas which have great contradictions. These are not easily understood. For example, something like modernity would bring in the idea of tradition. Where does tradition stand? Is tradition opposed to modernity? Is being modern, does it actually negate your being a traditional Malayali? So that's where I said the subjectivity of modern Malayali is wrought with contradiction. And this is where you find the modern Malayalam novel communicates a lot of ambivalence, lot of contradictions. I will sum up. Lot of, and this particularly has actually had its impact on the fate of modernity or in the evolution of modernity. All our discussions are actually contextualized, premised on the present. And we do face a certain crisis of modernity because the legacy of Malayali Navothanam, the Kerala Renaissance, has actually not in a way yielded what people hoped, actually an egalitarian society. We have actually prospered. Kerala may be, as Ravindran cited, a modern, quote unquote, modern society. But this modernity has our attitude towards women become really egalitarian? Are women in Kerala of that status, which, you see, they should have, you see, 100 years ago, Indulekha, in a way, symbolically stood in that particular location. Are we still there? And lastly, the question of caste, which again raises a number of issues. I don't have the time. Maybe if later I have the time, I will go into the question of slavery and modern Kerala. Sanal Mohan, a sociologist, has raised this question, the history of slavery and our modernity. Maybe we'll take it up in the next round.
We are talking indeed about the complexity of the concept. In fact, Dr. Ramakrishnan referred to Narayana Guru. Narayana Guru also said in relation to the Kerala Renaissance, not, of course, he was not talking about Renaissance, but he said that, the British or the colonial people also gifted us sannyasa. That is a very important statement, indicates the kind of complexity that we have in the concept of modernity. Certainly, I suppose we'll get some more time. Before that, Professor Jatin Naik will intervene.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. I will begin by saying that if we have a monolithic, like Professor Ramakrishna says, we have a monolithic narrative of modernity which is constructed largely by Europeans, then we have a problem, because once we think of modernity as a monolithic narrative, then some communities, some cultures, some civilizations are left out. And we think that we are always in the waiting room of history, that we will one day, the train of modernity will arrive, and perhaps if we are lucky, we'll get reservations and we'll jump into the train. So this account of modernity has always been, or at least for a long time, been contested. So the discussion on modernity has always been a contested terrain. And like Himangji said, I think we can also find elements of modernity in the Bhakti movement. And recently, Amit Chaudhary, on being Indian, talks about the emphasis on rationality in Bhakti poets like Kabir, like Lalan Fakir, where they emphasize argumentation, that you are interrogating tradition, you are not accepting anything passively, even in the pre-colonial, pre-modern, so-called pre-modern times. So I will before I begin, I'll just refer to a very interesting observation made by U.R. Ananthamurthy, one of his Samvatsar lectures, that for Europeans, for the West, I think history is a linear process. It's ancient, followed by medieval, followed by modern. But for Indians, I think the ancient, the medieval, and the so-called modern coexist. That we live, all these elements, all these periods coexist. And we have to constantly negotiate between all these, or among all these time periods. It's not a linear movement from barbarism to civilization, from pre-modern to modern. So given this context, I'll focus on Odia, the context of Odia literature, Odia culture. And like EVR, I will begin by saying that in the 19th century, under what is known as colonial modernity, Dilip calls it delightfully vague. But at least during colonialism, we had this dramatic confrontation with something that was called modern. And suddenly we were compelled, we were asked to disinherit our past. There is something terribly wrong with our past, and we must disinherit ourselves. So during the 19th century, the dramatic encounter between Western education, between print culture, between missionaries, and the so-called traditional culture took place. And the point I'm trying to make is that what resulted was a kind of negotiation, a series of negotiations, the history of which remains to be written. Because we are always talking about a kind of binary, modern, pre-modern, colonial, pre-colonial, but during the 19th century, a series of negotiations took place. It was a contested terrain. It was not a simple, passive acceptance. Of course, they were more powerful. We had to educate ourselves in the Western ways, but we had to also undermine, also negotiate with that. Well, I'll give you a few examples and then round off my presentation. Say, for instance, when the missionaries introduced printing technology in Odisha, for a long time there was great resistance to it. That people thought that if they touch a printed book, they will become Christians. So if you introduce printed books in a school, no student will enter that school. But gradually, over a period of, say, 15, 20, 30 years, educated Odias started embracing technology, embracing printing technology in a big way. And what did they do? The moment after the Great Famine, the moment they embraced printing technology, they not only brought out newspapers, they also tried to retrieve ancient Odia literature through printing technology. Say the Western education was introduced in schools. What did they do? Through translation, they introduced the essay as a literary form which didn't exist. So most of these essays which were prescribed for school children were actually translations from Western essays which focused on secular subjects, not strictly speaking on religion or entertainment. So things were changing, but people are not passively accepting them. Then I'll just come to two more examples and conclude. One is even higher education, which was introduced through colonialism. In 1922, English department was established in Ravenshaw College, the year in which T.S. Eliot's The Westland was published. So, and all these highly westernized teachers of English in Odisha, they taught English, they observed English, they were exposed to all the classics of European literature, but nearly all of them wrote in Odia. wrote novels, poems, Gopinath Mohanty, Ramakant Rath, Manoj Das, Mayadhar Mansingh, you name them, they all wrote in Odia. So that this was also a kind of negotiation with Western culture, negotiation with print technology, negotiation with Western education. And my final concluding example is Fakir Mohan Senapati. Uh, I'm sure some of you are familiar with his iconic novel, 6 Acres and a Third. Robinson, Fakir Mohan Senapati, although he had received very little formal education, had read Robinson Crusoe and was deeply influenced by it. So in 6 Acres and a Third, you have a Robinson Crusoe-like protagonist who is an isolated economic man. He doesn't understand human relationships. He only wants to maximize his wealth in whatever way he could. But unlike Defoe, Fakir Mohan Senapati doesn't celebrate him. Fakir Mohan Senapati laments, mourns the disintegration of an oral community, disintegration of a traditional rural agrarian order in which community bonds were getting loosened by certain Western values, the new legal system, for instance. So, the story of modernization of traditional societies under conditions of colonialism has to be told through attention to the series of complex and creative negotiations and resistance that took place. Lots of controversies took place between the new and the old. In periodicals, for instance, two periodicals fought a bitter battle to promote either medieval literature, Odia literature, or modern Odia literature. But finally, some kind of a rapprochement took place, and both observed elements from each other. So the story of Indian modernities, I'm so happy that it isn't pluralized, or it's beginning to be pluralized, and we are escaping the tyranny of the modern or the monolithic modern. But the story has to be told through all these complex and creative negotiations and perhaps resistance. Thank you.
I think we have some more time to discuss the issue. Before that, I just want to know whether we should uh, throw the issue open uh, to the. We can have one more brief round of discussion by the. Yeah. In fact, the point regarding modernity, Indian modernity, has been proved by the presentations themselves, because you have multiple views presented on. In fact, Hemant Desai was talking about of course, the distinction between modernity, modernism, and modernization. But he also referred to in a slightly dehistoricized way, the importance of looking upon modernity in non-historical terms. This, I think, is a contentious kind of position to take. Nevertheless, that is an important position in modernity, which should be discussed in forums of this kind. Manu Chakravarti was talking about primarily about the need to look upon modernity as not in westernized terms, but in typically local terms. And he also talked about the Bhakti movement with reference to that. E.V. Ramakrishnan was talking about the importance of the 19th century in the conceptualization of modernity, and the importance of printing presses and reforms of that kind, how it led to the development of modernity. Jatin Naik, he was also talking about that reference to Fakir Mohan Senapati and all. But his point, of course, it is the same that many of us have perhaps mentioned, the focus on the idea of negotiation that should go into the conceptualization of modernity. Anyway, I think each of us will get 2 minutes to perhaps to respond to other people's positions.
When we speak about modernity, and coming from Gujarat as I do, if I forget Mahatma Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, then the entire discourse would be incomplete. And I would like to draw your attention to that particular chapter in Hind Swaraj, chapter number 3, where Gandhi has been critical of lawyers, doctors, and trains. He says that these three things are going to be the bane of human civilization. So Gandhi's reservations about the Western variety of modernity are well known. Very famously, when on the eve of the independence, when some British journalist took Gandhi's interview and asked him, what do you think about the Western civilization? And he said it would be a good idea. So, why was Gandhi criticizing trains in particular? Because we know that after coming back from South Africa, Gandhi took a long train tour throughout the country in order to know the country, the landscape, the people, their concerns, etc. But what Gandhi was essentially doing was trying to attack the idea of speed that the train encapsulated. He was dead against the maddening speed at which the modernities or the civilization was being imposed on human subjectivities. To make it more simple, let me say Gandhi was trying to problematize the whole idea of the split that modernity puts in between the individual and the object, the objective world. The split between the researcher and what is researched. So he says that, like somebody would say that who invented penicillin, everybody knows the answer, right? But if we ask who invented Zyklon B, the gas that was used to kill the Jews in the concentration camps, or who invented orange bee, nobody will have the answer. Why do people don't have answer to this question? Gandhi would have said that people have evaded the responsibility of getting these answers. They have outsourced this responsibility on the state. Probably the state invented the gas and killed thousands of Jews, right? So I think in today's time, what is the function of a literary writer or a creator is to draw the attention of the people, the audience, the readership, the masses towards the inventor of the Zyklon B. And how can we act up and take action so that no such tragedies are repeated in the history of humanity. So I think we need to focus, as writers, as poets, as critics, it's very urgent, it's very important for us to talk about the issues which we have outsourced either to the state or to the institutions or to any other agency. Let us not be confined into the cocoon of formalism. Okay, let us not be carried away by the idea of aesthetics only. We also have to focus on issues of great relevance to our times. Yeah.
Something I would really place emphasis on is that in the Kannada tradition, there hasn't been a simplistic reductionist dismissal of the West, at least in terms of understanding and experience. In fact, much as the Kannada imagination, the Kannada cosmos, turned to local traditions, native traditions, there was also an attempt to look at the world, to look at the cosmos through the Kannada sensibility. In fact, if we go back to the 6th, 10th, 11th centuries, one of the great texts of Kannada, it's called Kaviraja Marga, Sri Vijaya. In fact, he says, Kannada, where is Kannada? Where do you find Kannada? He says it's embedded in the world, but the world enters Kannada. Kannada opens up to the world. Vasudha Valaya Vilinam. So Kannada is embedded there, and therefore it's impossible for me to avoid the world, to reject the world, to ignore the world. So there was no chauvinism, linguistic regional chauvinism, but it is through this Thaliya, the local, that the world opens up. And because you know the local, this Thaliya, this Thala, that you begin to imagine the whole global cosmos. And therefore, the Kannada mind throughout has never posited the West as a demon, as an enemy. In fact, the Greeks came to us through English into Kannada. Shakespeare came, the French writers came. Kannada has not avoided anything. I'm saying this because I believe, strongly believe, that this is true of all Indian writers, of all Indian thinkers. There was nothing that they saw as enemy. But when this adversarial position did not exist, it also did not mean that they were swept away by this so-called modernist programs. 1930, when Shivaram Karanth wrote his Chomanadudi, the question of Christianity as liberation came up in Chomanadudi. But when Karanta turned to questions of equality and justice, the Dalit, the untouchable, may find freedom from this totalizing Hindu structure. But when he moves, embraces Christianity, does it promise him? Does Western modernity, colonialism promise him equality and justice? So there is that degree of ambivalence. So when you turn to the progressives, they rejected British imperialism, but they started moving towards the leftist positions. They were all committed Marxists, but they were disillusioned. So at every step, the choice of something also meant running into difficulties. And therefore, they found it necessary to move towards more and more open spaces, ambivalent positions. The Dalits, in fact, it's a very, very important position for the Dalits in Karnataka, where they have started turning to their oral traditions. They have started turning to oralities, and therefore, even constitutionally, in terms of society, in terms of body polity, if they turn to modern constitutional programs in their literary imagination, consciousness, it's always a return to the past. By return to the past, it does not mean moving back, it only means renewing the past to draw great creative energies. Siddhalingaya was one who turned to Dalit fables. Dalit fables as an attempt to attack, to resist the Puranic fables, the overarching mythologies of upper caste Hindus, of Brahminical traditions, whatever you wish to call it. So there has always been this open negotiations, and therefore, if anything prevails to this day, it is always that negotiation between our past and the present, and not skirting the presence of this Western phenomena. And therefore, there is a whole complex of issues that surrounds the Kannada imagination. And so, the search for what would really establish principles of equality and justice, now that search begins to continue. And this, I think, is very crucial to an understanding of Indian modernities.
I thought I would draw your attention to a dialogue which happened between Narayana Guru and Mahatma Gandhi. The context was that of Vaikam temple entry satyagraha. And Periyar, Mahatma Gandhi, almost it attracted the whole the nation's attention. And Gandhi had come to Kerala. He actually negotiated with the owners of the temple. He was not very successful. But in his meeting with Narayana Guru, Gandhi wanted Narayana Guru to issue or at least make a comment that conversion is not something which will actually solve the problem of casteism. But Narayana Guru held his ground. He actually said, if people feel there can be greater mobility or greater freedom by converting themselves into another religion, there is nothing wrong in that. In fact, if all religions lead to the same kind of salvation, what's wrong in moving from one religion to the other? I cite this example to show that our modernity never followed single kind of what we call trajectories. There were multiple trajectories, and there were issues which were unresolved even today. And that's what actually makes it possible for us to sit here and debate Indian modernities. And from A.K. Ramanujan has a very interesting, insightful comment that modernity on the whole has been a movement from contextual kind of situation to context-free. So when you move away from a religious to secular, or a caste situation to a secular caste-free situation, that journey is something which you can call modern. But when we look at Gandhi, Ambedkar, Tagore, they all differed on very basic issues related to modernity. Perhaps between Gandhi and Tagore, there was agreement on the staunch opposition to the idea of nation, nationhood, nation state. They were all extremely suspicious of the nation state as the controlling authority of everything that will decide the fate of the ordinary citizens. So these are all issues which still remain open. I would actually argue that the question on modernities today attains greater importance because these open issues are still, in a way, nagging us with several questions which may not be within the purview of this small discussion. Thank you.
I think I have very little to add to all these very learned and insightful observations. All I would do is to say that, like Freud said, civilization and its discontents, we should focus on modernity and its discontents. And the lived experience of modernity should be focused upon, so that all the contradictions, all the conflicts within that can be highlighted or illuminated or explored. So we should talk about, like I just mentioned, on the negotiations and the resistance offered to certain kinds of modernity that's imposed on us. And we should pluralize it, to echo you.
Thank you, all the panelists. We have some 10 minutes for discussion. I'm sure the audience will have some response to make to the presentations here, and also to the overall question of modernity that has been raised. Yes. Make it brief. Yeah. Please make it brief.
Also, I'm talking about Malayalam also, that I had convinced. Okay. വൈക്കം സത്യാഗ്രഹത്തിൽ ഗാന്ധി വന്നിട്ട് നീലകണ്ഠൻ എന്നാന്ന് തോന്നുന്നു അങ്ങേരുടെ പേര്. അങ്ങനെ കാണാൻ പറ്റാണ്ട് അങ്ങേര് പറഞ്ഞ് പുറത്തിരുന്നിട്ടാണ് ചർച്ച ചെയ്തത്. അതൊരു ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ. അതിൽ നിന്നിട്ട് എത്രമാത്രം നമ്മൾ മാറി എന്നുള്ള ഇന്ത്യൻ മോഡേണിറ്റി എന്നുള്ള പേര്. പിന്നെ നമ്മൾ ഈ ജനാധിപത്യത്തെ കുറിച്ചൊക്കെ പറയുമ്പോൾ ചെങ്കോല് പാർലമെന്റിൽ വെച്ചുകൊണ്ട് സ്ഥാപിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് അതിനെ രാഷ്ട്രപതി മുൻപിൽ നിന്നുകൊണ്ട് നയിച്ചുകൊണ്ടാണ് നമ്മൾ ജനാധിപത്യത്തെ കുറിച്ചിട്ടും മോഡേണിറ്റിയെ കുറിച്ചും പറയുന്നത്. പിന്നെ ചന്ദ്രനിലേക്ക് റോക്കറ്റ് വിട്ടുമ്പോൾ അതിന് 2 ദിവസം മുമ്പ് ഭാരതകുമാർ എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ബൈജയ് ശുക്ല എന്ന് പറയുന്ന സംഘപരിവാർ മൂത്രമൊഴിച്ചുകൊണ്ടാണ് നമ്മൾ ഈ മോഡേണിറ്റിയെ കുറിച്ച് സംസാരിക്കണം കൂടി ആലോചിക്കണം. പിന്നെ ഗാന്ധി പറഞ്ഞു അയോധ്യയിലിപ്പോൾ അയോധ്യ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ തന്നെ യുദ്ധമില്ല എന്നാണ് അതിൻ്റെ അർത്ഥം. അവിടെ ബാലരാമനെ സ്ഥാപിച്ചിരിക്കുന്നു. ആ ബാലരാമനെ സ്ഥാപിച്ചത് അതിന് മുന്നേ 52-ൽ കേശിപ്പാന്ത് സ്വയംഭൂവാണ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞുകൊണ്ട് അവിടെ ഒരു വിഗ്രഹം പൊന്തി വന്നു എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടാണ് ക്ഷേത്രം അടയ്ക്കുന്നത്. അപ്പോൾ നെഹ്റു പറഞ്ഞു അത് സരായു നദിയിൽ പൂട്ടിയിട്ട് എറിയാൻ. ഇനി അവിടെ നിന്നിട്ട് നമ്മൾ എത്രമാത്രം മാറി എന്നുള്ളതാണ് നമ്മൾ ചിന്തിക്കുന്നത്. ഈ വിഗ്രഹം കൊത്തിയെടുത്ത ബാലരാമന്റെ ക്ഷേത്രം പണിയാൻ പോവാണ് കർണാടകത്തിൽ. ഭാഷ ആലോചിക്കണം. നമ്മൾ മോഡേണിറ്റി കൂട്ടി പറയുമ്പോൾ ഇന്ത്യ എവിടെയാണ് നിൽക്കുന്നത്? രാമരാജ്യം. ഈ രാമരാജ്യം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ് ഈ വില്ലെടുത്ത് നിൽക്കുന്ന രാമൻ എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഈ ശംഭുവിന്റെ തലർത്ത രാമൻ എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഈ മാതൃക പുരുഷനാവുന്നത്? അറിയാണ്ട് ചോദിക്കുക. സ്വന്തം ഭാര്യയെ കാട്ടിലേക്ക് വിട്ടവൻ. ഇതെന്നാ എന്റെ ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻസ് ആണ് ഇതൊക്കെ. അല്ല ഇല്ലേ നീട്ടണില്ല. അപ്പൊ ഈ നമ്മൾ മോഡേണിറ്റിയെ പറ്റി പറയുമ്പോൾ 5000 വർഷം മുമ്പുള്ള കാര്യങ്ങളാണ് നമ്മളിപ്പോ ഡിസ്കസ് ചെയ്യുന്നതെന്നും കൂടി ആലോചിക്കണം നമ്മുടെ രാജ്യത്ത്. ബസ്
അതാണ് നമ്മൾ ആക്ച്വലി മോഡേണിറ്റിയെ പറ്റി ഡിസ്കസ് ചെയ്യാനുള്ള കോണ്ടെക്സ്റ്റ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. ഇപ്പോൾ പറഞ്ഞതില്ലേ, ഈ ഒരു കോണ്ടെക്സ്റ്റിലാണ് നമ്മൾ മോഡേണിറ്റിയെ ഡിസ്കസ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. അല്ലെങ്കിൽ നമ്മൾ മോഡേണിറ്റി ആരും ഇവിടെ ഡിസ്കസ് ചെയ്യില്ല. കാരണം മോഡേണിറ്റിയുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ട മൂല്യങ്ങൾ വളരെ നിഷ്കരുണം എന്ന് തന്നെ പറയട്ടെ ആയ രീതിയിൽ അത് ചവിട്ടി മതിക്കപ്പെടുന്നു. അത് ഭരണാധികാരികളുടെ ഭാഗത്തു നിന്ന് തന്നെ. അപ്പോൾ അത് എന്ന് മാത്രമല്ല, അത് ഒരുതരം മൂല്യമായി, സാമൂഹിക മൂല്യമായി ഉയർന്നു വരാനുള്ള ആ ഒരു ഭീഷണി നമ്മുടെ മുന്നിൽ നിലനിൽക്കുകയും ചെയ്യുന്നു. അതാണ് വാസ്തവത്തിൽ ഇങ്ങനെ ഒരു പാനലിൽ ഞാൻ പങ്കെടുക്കാനുള്ള ഒരു കാരണം. അതാണ്, എനിക്കറിയില്ല അതാണോ, ഇങ്ങനെ ഒരു ആയിരിക്കാൻ തന്നെയാണ് സാധ്യത. ഇങ്ങനെ ഒരു പാനൽ ഡിസ്കഷൻ ഉണ്ടാക്കാനുള്ള കാര്യവും അതിൽ മലയാളികളല്ലാത്ത ആളുകളെ കൂടി ഉൾപ്പെടുത്തി അത്തരം ഒരു പൊതു ചർച്ച ഉയർത്തിക്കൊണ്ടുവരാനും ഈ അക്കാഡമിയെ പ്രേരിപ്പിച്ചത് മിക്കവാറും ഇത് തന്നെ ആയിരിക്കണം എന്നാണ് ഞാൻ വിചാരിക്കുന്നത്.
Sir, this is true.
എങ്ങനെ? അല്ല, അതിൻ്റെ കോംപ്ലക്സിറ്റിയിൽ പെടും, അതിൻ്റെ സങ്കീർണതയിൽ ഇത് പറഞ്ഞതൊക്കെ പെടും. ഇതൊക്കെ അതിൻ്റെ സങ്കീർണതകളിൽ പെടുന്നതാണ്.
Yes. This is true, Hemant Desai. You raised a very serious modernity, alternative modernity, of a kind of ecological modernity, because you are speaking about a decarbonized, urban, parallel paradigm. We so far, as we always say of science fiction is figuring out alternative cosmoses as alternative galaxies. Likewise, you are speaking for a alternative modernity of ecology. My question is really, since you are coming from Gujarat, what would be Gandhi's vision of his expression or interpretation on the automation of cognition by ChatGPT and the rest, all artificial intelligence tools? What would be Gandhiji's response on that? Because you are for a green GDP state, not at all a greedy GDP. You are speaking for a green GDP paradigm. Then my question is regarding a green internet, a green AI, a green ChatGPT. Then what would be? I am asking a hypothetical question. If Gandhi returns today, what would be his stance on ChatGPT and the rest?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, I cannot speak on behalf of Gandhi, but I can always speculate. For example, in his time, Gandhi was an advocate of. He was like he advocated for the banning of alcohol from Gujarat and elsewhere, right? So he was anti-alcohol sort of individual. But in today's time, Gandhi would not have talked about banning of alcohol, but he would have definitely talked about banning of sugar drinks, the cold drinks. Because sugar is the greatest evil which is taking a toll on human health, like no other thing is doing at the moment. So, speaking of, well, what Gandhi's take would be on sort of green ChatGPT, green internet, well, I'm clueless. But I can say this much, that in his recent book, Bill Gates is talking about the accommodation project. He says that if all the poor of the world are to be given a house, then for the next 40 years, the world will have to build a New York City every year, a full New York City every year.
Okay.
But on the other hand, what is happening is that the humans are using the sand at a rate which is faster than the rate at which the earth produces the sand.
Okay.
So on the one hand, there is a need for giving homes to poor, but on the other hand, the earth is also speaking back. So the earth, we will have to find a middle ground between technology and the concerns of humanity.
Okay, sir. That is EV innovation, sir. Sir, you said that in 1888, Narayana Guru consecrated Shiva, a stone. The next year, 1889, Indulega was born. How you link it? Because We link, therefore we are. As Descartes said, we think, therefore we are. I link, therefore we are. We link, therefore we are. So how you link Indulekha and the conspiration of Shiva by Narendra?
It's an interesting question. Now, in our modernity, there are several trajectories. So, when you look at Narayana Guru's consecration, it's a very important event which redefined the Kerala attitude towards caste system, the hegemonic power of Brahmins. He questioned in a very simple, symbolic action, he questioned the hegemonic right of Brahmins to consecrate an idol. And this was revolutionary, this was radical. Of course, in creating the character of Indulekha, we have another equally radical, equally revolutionary kind of imagination. There is a social imagination at work in both Narayana Guru's act as well as in the creation of a new form called the novel. There is a certain imagination at work. And Malayali imagination actually, in a way, you see, that's where the idea of modern is born. Modern is basically an imaginary, you see, which made us possible to look at cosmopolitan and, you see, much larger kind of identities. I hope my point is understood.
അതുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ട് ഈ ചോദ്യത്തിന് പറഞ്ഞ അതിൻ്റെ ഒരു അനുബന്ധം എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിൽ പറയാവുന്നത്, ഇപ്പോൾ ട്രഡീഷനെ റീഡിഫൈൻ ചെയ്യുന്ന ഒരു പദ്ധതിയാണ് വാസ്തവത്തിൽ മോഡേണിറ്റി. ഇപ്പോൾ ട്രഡീഷൻ എന്താണെന്നുള്ളത് അവിടെ ഡിഫൈൻ ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട്. ട്രഡീഷൻ പരമ്പരാഗതമായി വിഗ്രഹപ്രതിഷ്ഠ നടത്താൻ അധികാരമുള്ള ജനങ്ങൾ ആരൊക്കെയാണ് എന്നതിനെപ്പറ്റി ട്രഡീഷൻ ഒരു ധാരണയുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ അതിൽ നിന്ന് മാറിയുള്ള ഒരു ആക്ടിവിറ്റിയാണ്, നോൺ ട്രഡീഷണൽ ആക്ടിവിറ്റി ആണ്. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് അതൊരു മോഡേൺ ആക്ടിവിറ്റി ആവുന്നത്. നോവൽ എഴുതുന്നതും അങ്ങനെ തന്നെയാണ്. കാരണം അതുവരെ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്ന വ്യവഹാരത്തിൻ്റെ രീതി എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് നോവലിൻ്റെ രീതിയല്ല. കാരണം നിങ്ങൾ എഴുതുന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ നിങ്ങൾ പിന്നെ പറഞ്ഞില്ല, രാമകൃഷ്ണ മാഷ് പറഞ്ഞ ഘാതകവധം എഴുതുക. ഘാതകവധം ഒരു മോറൽ സ്റ്റോറിയാണ്. ഇതിലും ഒരു മോറൽ സ്റ്റോറി നമുക്ക് വേണേൽ കാണാം. ഒരു അവസാനം അതുകൊണ്ട് എല്ലാവരും പിന്നെ എല്ലാ സ്ത്രീജനങ്ങളും പിന്നെ എന്തൊക്കെ ചെയ്യണം എന്നൊക്കെ അതിൻ്റെ അവസാനം ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് പഠിക്കണം എന്നൊക്കെ പറയുന്നുണ്ട്. അത് അതിൻ്റെ ഭാഗമാണോ അല്ലയോ എന്നുള്ളത് നമുക്ക് തീർച്ചയല്ലതാനോ. അപ്പോൾ എങ്ങനെയാണ് അങ്ങനെ ഒരു ഇതുണ്ട്. എന്തായാലും ട്രഡീഷനെ റീഡിഫൈൻ ചെയ്യാം. അപ്പോൾ കാരണം മോഡേണിറ്റി ഈസ് നോൺ ട്രഡീഷൻ. അത് പക്ഷേ ഒരു വെസ്റ്റേൺ എന്ന് പറയുന്ന വെസ്റ്റേണൈസ്ഡ് ഐഡിയ ഓഫ് മോഡേണിറ്റി ആണ് എന്ന് പലതരത്തിലുള്ള വിമർശനവും അതിൻ്റെ ഭാഗമായി നിലനിൽക്കുന്നുമുണ്ട്. അതാണ് അതിൻ്റെ ഒരു ക്രൂഷ്യലായി നമുക്ക് ആലോചിക്കാവുന്നത്.
Sir, modernity, it worked in Kerala society, we know, according to the Pravasi writers like Zakaria, Anand, like Kakanadan. It works in Kerala society. But in Indian atmosphere, how the modernity works?
Were you at the beginning here?
No.
We made a distinction between modernity and modernism.
Okay.
If you are not talking about modernism, you can proceed. Otherwise, I think you will have to modify your question.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, we have come to the end of it. Unless there is some pressing question someone wants to raise, we can close the session here.
So, both Manu Chakravarti and Hemang talked about the stateless societies in the earlier civilizations. But nowadays, what we can see in India is something like a concentrated power which is coming through democracy itself. But I wish to point out about the case of Malabar, where we had the culture of Theyyam, which was considered as the earlier form of a stateless society's power distribution. But nowadays, what we can see in all these places, even in the southern Kannada region also, what we can see is that these Aryanized gods are integrated into this earlier cow system, and the entire tradition is getting changed. If not, don't mind, please respond to that. And one question to E.V. Ramakrishnan also. This, as all of you said, modernity very much affected, influenced the literature form. And Kerala Malayalam literature progressed over time to several kinds of genre and other, it incorporated several themes. But what we can see nowadays is that in the college community, in the students community, the novels of Sunil Parameswaran or Ashwati Tirunal, which is concentrated more on something called Mantriga novels or this something like palace novels or divine novels, they are getting more popular than any other kinds of the so-called classics. How you can see this change in this reading culture?
I think the last part of the question is addressed to me. In fact, this whole idea of Amish Tripathi, like narratives, a whole set of, I would say we have lost track of the secular modern. The secular modern as a liberating concept, it actually allowed the novel to, you see, deal with a variety of experiences from subaltern to, you see, a whole lot of. If you look at the evolution of modern Malayalam novel, it has democratically inclusive kind of a vision. It has always sustained a democratic, inclusive vision, and that's what makes it unique and extremely relevant to the modernity of Kerala. But we are actually losing that larger vision. Definitely, there is a regressive idea of a shrinking space of modernity as we actually enter the globalized neoliberal society. Perhaps the pressure of neoliberal is a kind of a world. Somewhere it robs us of our own identities. We are, there may be real or imaginary kind of reasons why we are becoming more and more regressive. But I do understand there are many novelistic kind of writings. They actually are, I wouldn't say they all should project, there is no manifesto saying that all novels should, but there is a very important, when you see the Odia novel, Fakir Mohan Senapati's, it's almost 150, 120 years old now, but 6 acres and a third, it has a kind of ironic consciousness which is so liberating. Even today, that novel actually sets Oriya literature apart. And it also, you see, this is the critical function of the novel. Novel is basically something which opens up society. Novel is something which actually gives you a counter-cultural kind of, it questions prevailing notions of maybe modernity or you see lack of modernity. But increasingly we are becoming prisoners of certain fancy ideas which I think are gradually, you see, confining us, extremely, you see, confining us to regressive kind of ideologies. It's a fact. Thank you for that question.
I will only answer in brief. There is the state, the existence of the state, a historical reality which cannot be wished away. But how do you come to terms with it, make it obey the constitution which is being flouted? But I would only say, you see, I will only turn to my teacher, Ananthamurthy. The models that came to us, and all others follow that model. It's not a model in a strict sense, but you can see it as an open paradigm. The whole problem for us was addressed through the anarchic vision of the Mahabharata. I'm talking of the Kannada imagination, especially through Ananthamurthy, and I will end soon. It came to us through Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, Tagore's text Nationalism. All these happened in our classes. And Gora, Home and the World, and Gopinath Mohanty's Paraja, the collusion of the new forces, economic forces, the nexus between the new economic forces and the ruling state. So when you turn to his most important political novel, Avaste, it's a severe interrogation of the so-called democratic system. And the last text he published was Hindutva or Hind Swaraj, written in Kannada, which we revised and brought out in English. But so there has always been that streak of anarchism, shall we say, in the classical sense. And therefore, he wrote a very important essay, Rajana Bhiti, Rajanillada Bhiti, fear of the king and fear of a kingless state. So anarchy is different from the classical kind of anarchism. So there has always been this struggle to look for the democratic spaces. Democratic spaces not merely politically, but more importantly, culturally. Thank you.
Thank you for being very patient. I was just asking them if there is any official vote of thanks. In the absence of that, I thank all the panelists who have attended this session, and I also thank you who have been patiently listening to the people here. Thank you very much.